So we have an incredible wealth of expertise to help us explore this important issue, and we're going to start with Andrew McLaughlin. Andrew McLaughlin is a relentlessly curious problem solver. I know that because I sat next to him at dinner last night. He has been a tech executive, a public official, and an internet freedom activist. He's currently Senior Vice President at BetaWorks, CEO of DIGG and Instapaper, and Chairman of the Board of Access, an international human rights organization that works to protect online freedom. Previously, he was a member of the senior White House staff, serving as Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States. In that role, he advised President Obama on internet, technology, and innovation policy, including open government, cybersecurity, online privacy, and free speech. He's also been Vice President of Tumblr, Director of Global Public Policy at Google, and Vice President of ICANN, the Internet's technical coordinating organization. Please join me in welcoming Andrew McLaughlin.
Relentlessly curious is usually a code word for incredibly annoying. So thanks for the kind introduction. It's funny actually listening to my own bio. You know, it's in an age in which at this point the kind of technical reputation of the Obama administration is defined by healthcare.gov and the NSA surveillance revelations. Makes me think I need to seriously adjust my my bio and suppress some elements of my life. So what I want to do this morning is very briefly frame up the issue that we're going to talk about in the panel. The question before us is, how screwed is the U.S. when it comes to being an advocate of internet freedom, and what can we do about it? So I've got basically 3 points that I want to hit. The first one is to talk a little bit about what it is we actually mean when we talk about internet freedom. The second is to make the argument that we as an advocate for freedom of speech and privacy worldwide are much more screwed than we generally think in Washington, and that American industry and our internet sector is much more screwed internationally than we think, especially over the long term. And then third, I want to talk a little bit about what I think we can do about it. So the first point is to talk about what it is we're talking about when we talk about internet freedom. So there's basically 2 broad topics that comprise this issue set. One of them is censorship and freedom of expression. The second one is surveillance and its coordinate privacy. And in both of these areas, the United States government is now seen to be profoundly hypocritical. In the area of censorship and free speech, the driver over a number of years has been our trade negotiating policy. So on the one hand, over the last 4 years, Secretary Clinton would be actively articulating an ethical and a practical case for freedom of expression and an economic case for the free flow of information around the world, while at the same time our trade negotiators would be sitting down across from the very same governments urging them to build censorship technologies into their infrastructures in order to protect the interests of Hollywood and big content. And it's an incredible disjunction. It's happened for any number of reasons. We tend to have a regulatory capture in this country when our agencies become too close to the industries that they are associated with. And in the case of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and the associated bureaucracies that go along with it, the revolving door is as bad as it is anywhere in the United States government. And so as a result, we see, and it's also below the level of the radar screen of our most senior officials. And so foreign governments, which tend to be a lot better coordinated than governments which are as big as ours, tend to be puzzled by the fact that they will be urged to protect free and open flows of information on the one hand, while at the same time being browbeaten by our trade negotiators into agreeing to the notion that they need to be able to restrict free flows of information in order to stop illegal downloading of movies, let's say. So the hypocrisy on censorship has been seen for a long time. I think it's not very evident in Washington. Most people, even in the White House, aren't aware that this kind of fundamental tension exists. But it is one of the things that's poisoned our relationships with a number of other countries, particularly not our closest allies, but countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, Russia, countries for whom we are sometimes friends and sometimes competitors, and for whom the kind of monopolar world is now very palpably giving way to a multipolar new chapter. And so then on surveillance, the second issue cluster, I think the hypocrisy that is now seen worldwide is obvious. I don't need to say much about it, but the U.S. government has now very much shot itself in the foot when it comes to being seen as an effective advocate for the protection of privacy from governmental surveillance. The big issue, which kind of lies at the heart of our practices in this area, is that our surveillance takes place within a, however flawed, rule of law that has mechanisms for the protection of civil rights and civil liberties, at least for Americans. And so even though there are, I think, problems in the way that we do judicial oversight, for example, and the non-adversarial nature of filings before the FISA court, and the fact that the select committee model in the U.S. Congress is not a very effective one for doing legislative branch oversight. Nevertheless, we broadly have a system of laws, and I can say from my 2 years in the White House, working a lot on cybersecurity, I was quite impressed with how seriously the NSA takes their responsibility to protect American civil rights and civil liberties. The issue, of course, is that the internet is a global network, packets flow across national borders, and for our intelligence agencies to be able to do the surveillance on non-Americans that they are charged with doing, it's very difficult to figure out how you can do that without sweeping in the communications of Americans. So as a technical matter, this is fundamentally difficult. Anyway, that's point number one, which is censorship and surveillance and the hypocrisy that goes along with it. Point number two is that we are much more screwed than I think most policymakers in Washington are aware. So the level of anger and the degree of betrayal that people in many of the countries that are closest to the United States, emerging democracies all, is intense and ever present now, I think, in policymaking around the internet. On the business side, though, we've only barely begun in Washington, I think, to grasp the severity of the harm that's going to be inflicted over the next decade from the perception that U.S. internet companies, U.S. technology companies broadly, are willing instruments of the violation of civil rights and civil liberties of people in other countries. And so, broadly speaking, what I think has happened is that we have essentially nationalized what were previously seen as stateless internet entities, right? So a few years ago, Twitter, Facebook, Google, especially among younger people around the world, were just viewed as internet. They weren't particularly American. They were sort of an American ethos, but they were seen as kind of these stateless internet entities that delivered great services and that were fighting on the same side for things like freedom of speech. In countries like China and India, where it's very much under threat. But now what we've done is we've turned them into American companies by showing that they are essentially vehicles by which the United States government gets its hands on information about people outside the United States. So, this happens in small ways and large. One of the small ways was, if you all remember, when the Green Revolution was taking place in Iran, an American official essentially took credit for keeping Twitter on when they were going to shut down for some maintenance. Twitter people always are irritated by that because they don't feel like it had anything to do with it. But here was the U.S. government basically publicly, patting itself on the back for keeping Twitter going in an incredibly tense situation where Twitter was a significant force in the flow of information about what was happening on the ground in Iran. And again, just associates it as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. law, and now U.S. surveillance as a consequence of the latest round of Snowden revelations. So obviously there are headaches for sales. If you're an American company that sells cloud services, I think you've probably sold your last contract to a foreign government. I mean, I don't see any way in which American companies can now be service providers to foreign governments, ever. India recently banned its officials from using any email service with any server in the United States. And so what that points to is the coming fragmentation of the internet. So on a technical level, this is something that we've been quite worried about for a long time and have fought aggressively, and I think in a very sophisticated way as a government and as an industry over the last 10 years to try to fight against efforts to draw in cyberspace the national borders that exist in the real world. The answer is because we believe in the free flow of information and all of the business advantages for not just American companies, but any internet company around the world that come along with that. But what we're going to see is increasing numbers of governments requiring that internet services be located within their own physical borders and that no data be exported outside their borders in order to do two things. One is to maintain control. And so even if you're a democratic government with a commitment to rule of law, you still would like to have some degree of control over the information that your citizens are putting online. Part of that is, to just be able to fight crime and to do investigations and to not have to send a request to the United States government every time you want to conduct a law enforcement investigation of something like, let's say, fraud or child porn or whatever it might be. And some of it is a desire to build up national champions. In other words, if you are the European Union, you're overjoyed right now because A, you can finally require, credibly, in the eyes of your own countries, citizen data to be stored within the borders of the European Union and not exported to the United States. And two, you have created a massive market opportunity for European companies to arise to provide competing services that otherwise would have been much more cheaper and effectively delivered by American companies. And so this even comes to affect, I think, the ability of the United States to attract great talent. If you're starting a startup now and you're a Brazilian, you probably don't want to come into the United States and start it up from the perspective of your reputational, long-term reputational, from the perspective of the long-term reputational harm that goes along with having your cloud service be United States-based, maybe. And American tech companies may not be able to recruit the best talent because maybe if you're an ambitious Indian, you don't want to be seen as having sold out to the man and gone to work for a company in the United States for some number of years. So from my perspective, this is sort of like all bad, and it's much worse than I think policymakers are currently giving it credit for. And broadly, I think it's just important to keep in mind that there's a long-term geopolitical strategy at play here. It started to play out in the ICANN process, at least in my experience, which was when you saw this odd coalition of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, the BRICS countries, and some of the other rising democracies, Turkey, band together to try to figure out how to wrest control of internet infrastructure from the hands of the U.S. It's now been given sort of rocket fuel because there's now a moral component to it. It's not simply a kind of a practical, desire or a sort of theoretical, I should say, it's not really a theoretical desire to just have some form of control, but rather it is now backed up by the moral claim that all of these efforts to shift and establish control and to ace out United States companies is a form of protecting the privacy and civil liberties of your own citizens, which I think is disastrous. Okay, so what do we do about it? Well, so from the perspective of the administration, and I am a loyalist of the administration, there was a huge squandered opportunity when the president decided to set up a sort of a half-hearted review panel under the auspices of the Director of National Intelligence to take a look at the issue. And I think the squandered opportunity was that the fundamental harm here is to trust. So Americans now, I think, are increasingly distrustful of the United States' apparatus of oversight and limitation on the capabilities that we have. And globally, people don't trust that the United States intelligence services are not totally out of control. I actually don't think they are, but I think that's the perception. And the gap between perception and reality is what needs to be addressed. My view is that what would have been a terrific choice by the administration would have been to set up some kind of a commission, not almost borrowing a playbook from the British, who always set up a commission every time anything bad happens because they want to bury the issue in a bureaucratic process. But this is one of those rare cases where I actually think that a high-level commission, left, right, and center, with a long time period, say a year, and a mandate to do everything from conduct public hearings to get classified briefings, and then to produce a genuine report at the end that would talk about, for example, how to introduce adversarial elements into judicial oversight, how to make legislative oversight effective, how to audit and verify what it is we're doing with the data that we're gathering, would have done a world of good, a public airing of those issues. As it stands now, we're not really going to have that. And one of the things that I would urge human rights advocates in Washington to think about is whether something like the 9/11 Commission model might not make sense. The 9/11 Commission was, everybody thinks it was some kind of official entity, but it was just the Brookings Institution. They just put together some very serious people in the capital V, capital S, capital C sense. I gave them a mandate and some budget to go out and look at everything that had happened in 9/11 and make some recommendations about it. And it was incredibly influential. Its recommendations became the to-do list for United States intelligence reform after 9/11. So then, the other thing I have to mention, of course, is that we need to fix our trade negotiating policy. We just simply can't be going out there and advocating willy-nilly and uncritically for the interests of Hollywood and urging that censorship technologies be baked into the internet at the same time that we're urging countries not to do that. I think it is possible for us to advance the interests of our content industry in Hollywood without going down the road, this tired, old, broken road of advocating for censorship in order to stop copyright infringement. And then finally, for tech companies, this is much trickier. And I think what you're going to see is tech companies basically trying to figure out how to make themselves stateless again and how to become global brands. Some of this is going to be in the way that they offer their products, and some of it is going to be in the way that they build their infrastructure. The one revelation that's come out that really troubled me was the reports that the NSA set up wiretaps between data centers. So basically what Google has always done is it's encrypted communication, I shouldn't say always, but for the last several years, has very effectively encrypted communications that run from your device to their front-end servers. What happens, though, is that they decrypt it at their front-end servers, and then within the Google universe of leased line connections among their data centers all over the world, these are owned and controlled by Google, at least they thought. They didn't need to worry about encryption. They would just transfer the data around because it was inside the Google universe. What we now think to be true, if the papers are to be believed anyway, is that the NSA was wiretapping the connections between data centers because the communications there were unencrypted. They basically were tapping into Google's network without Google's permission, Microsoft's network without Microsoft's permission, Yahoo's network without Yahoo's permission, and so forth. That's catastrophic. I think that is genuinely a betrayal of the trust that those companies had in the U.S. government to always follow the due process of law, to always have legally valid requests on a one-for-one basis. Now these companies are basically figuring out how to encrypt communications between their data centers, which will cost more money and make what they do more expensive. And I think there is a final consequence of that, which is that in order to de-statify yourself, in order to be able to build an infrastructure which will satisfy Brazilian law about privacy, European law about privacy, Japanese law about privacy, Indian law about privacy, and so forth and so on, is going to be incredibly expensive. They're going to have to decentralize their infrastructures just to have rudimentary credibility within those countries. And that means that there's going to be a huge advantage to incumbents, to the companies that are already big today and already making money, because they're the only ones that can afford to do that. I think that's another negative consequence to the revelations that have come out. Anyway, those are my opening remarks. Over to Jacob.
Okay, that was a terrific and somewhat depressing overview of our challenge. And my job now is much easier, which is to introduce Jacob Weissberg and turn it over to you all to help us figure out how you solve this. Jacob is one of the country's most accomplished journalists. He's been a writer and editor for The New Republic, a reporter for Newsweek, a political writer for New York Magazine, a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and a contributing editor for Vanity Fair. In 1996, he joined the then new online magazine Slate and became its chief political correspondent and then its editor. And now he's chairman of the Slate Group, a unit of the Washington Post company devoted to developing a family of internet-based publications through startups and acquisitions. The Slate Group's roster includes Slate, The Root, and the video site Slate V. Weissberg is also the author of several books, including The Bush Tragedy, which was a New York Times bestseller in 2008. Please welcome Jacob Weissberg and this illustrious panel.
Thanks so much. And before I get into asking Andrew some questions about his provocative remarks, I want to just briefly introduce my fellow panelists here. To my left is Rebecca MacKinnon, who's the Senior Research Fellow at the New America Foundation. She leads the Ranking Digital Rights Project, which is developing a methodology to rank internet and telecom companies on free expression and privacy criteria. She began as a journalist working for CNN in Asia for many years. She is something of a China expert, and she is the author most recently of a book I highly recommend, Consent of the Network, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom, which was published last year. And to her left is Ambassador Phil Verveer. Ambassador Verveer is a senior counselor at the FCC. Before that, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. He left that role because the title was too long. He's a very distinguished communications and antitrust lawyer. He's also served in the military as an Army captain in Korea. Thanks to you both for joining us. And I just want to get right into some of the interesting things you said, Andrew. And I should say here that I probably agree with most of them, but I may be a little bit in the role of devil's advocate here. But the first question is about why we should view copyright as a potential free expression issue. I mean, human rights advocates, a lot of whom are in this room, have enough real stuff to worry about without making this question of commercial protection for commercial speech a human rights issue.
Yeah, I don't think copyright is a sort of like a top-line human rights issue, but I think it sets the stage for why countries have been skeptical of the United States on internet freedom for a while. The short version of the problem here is that Hollywood, the recording industry, content owners have a legitimate problem with the internet, which is to say that it's extremely easy to make copies and therefore to commit copyright infringement. It's true. It's a legitimate problem. The problem is that for a long time, I think in their kind of lack of creativity, in the fearfulness with which they've looked at changes in their business model, the kind of like tiredness and cluelessness of their leadership, they've gotten seduced by the idea that the way to fight that problem is to have the internet do their policing for them. And so they have long been advocating in international trade deals that we push half of U.S. copyright law, which is to say the protections without the exceptions and limitations, which we call fair use broadly, that actually enable the internet to function as a practical matter. Every time Slate publishes an article, I make a copy of it in my browser. That's just how it gets transmitted. And that's okay with you because you've authorized that. And if I cut a snippet out of it and publish it on my blog, that's protected by fair use. But anyway, the problem is that in these formal agreements, we've been pushing governments to authorize infrastructures of control that we also advocate that they don't implement when Secretary Clinton talks about the restrictions on flows of information in places like China. That's the sort of the nub of it.
But in practice, and I understand why the internet community doesn't like it, but in practice, the technology is not being implemented on the pretext of copyright protection and used for censoring political speech. Where is that happening?
Sure. Well, a great example of this is India and Pakistan. So in both of these countries, they have been depressingly active in recent years at trying to suppress unwanted speech. So in Pakistan's case, there are a number of services that are blocked. In India's case, to the surprise of most people, a number of websites and services have been blocked at the national level. And if you ask the Indians about it, they'll tell you, well, this is just sort of like best practice. This is what we do. And there's similar examples in Australia, in parts of the former Soviet Union. And it's not so much the practical issue that I'm worried about here, because I think the steam has gone out of this. It's the hypocrisy that foreign governments attribute to the United States for advocating two inconsistent positions at the same time in different meetings.
Yeah.
That I think is the fundamental problem.
Well, on that point, I want to open it up to both of you, and maybe starting with Ambassador Verveer, because this hypocrisy point is an interesting and very slippery one. I mean, in the world of human rights, there has never been a time in which the United States has not been accused of hypocrisy when it has made any case about human rights internationally. You know, the Soviets would bring up the homeless in America and civil rights issues and the lack of health insurance. And do we have to draw a distinction here between genuine hypocrisy and accused hypocrisy, and given that we're going to be constantly accused of hypocrisy, what's going on here?
So yeah, let me just make one point about that.
I'll turn to Ambassador.
Yeah, just to say one thing about that. So unlike a lot of my friends in the kind of human rights activist community, I have no problem with the capabilities that the United States has got. In other words, I don't think it's hypocritical at all for us to be surveilling.
Somebody
You,
doesn't
in
like
fact,
what you're
right
saying.
now.
To be,
It's your controllers.
I don't think it's at all hypocritical for us to be surveilling our allies, to be surveilling the G20 summit in Toronto. You know, if you accept that we live in a world where there are people trying to, for example, get their hands on fissile materials in Central Asia and then turn them into, should I just turn this off? Is that my mic? Oh, there we go. Yeah. If you accept that there are, bad people trying to do bad things, then it's absolutely essential for the United States to have extraordinarily powerful, effective, and targeted surveillance capabilities. We should. And so I don't think we're I don't think we're at moral or other risk of hypocrisy in that sense, that we need to somehow stop doing what we're doing. The problem is that the world doesn't trust us not to abuse those powers. Americans, I think, are increasingly distrustful, and the world doesn't trust us. So it's a gap in perception that is harming our economic interests, and it harms our diplomatic interests as an advocate for free speech and privacy and other human rights that go along with that. Anyway, so what I view as the problem is that kind of like trust gap, as well as a number of things that I think need to be done in order to merit trust. Now, for Americans, it's pretty straightforward. I think there are a number of structural changes that we ought to make in order to be sure that we are using the capabilities that we've got. There are probably some substantive limits that should be placed on things like wholesale data collection in the hands of the U.S. government, because they're so prone to abuse that we just ought not go down that road, because there are practical ways we can do it otherwise. But then internationally, we genuinely as a government don't care about foreign citizens. We just don't. We just don't care about their rights and interests. And that's got to change. The United States government is being hypocritical there.
So, Ambassador, just to start with you, I mean, do you think the U.S. government was abusing its powers, and are we being hypocritical?
Well, let me begin by saying, in these kinds of discussions, it is important to recognize that there are a lot of people who have a kind of Hobbesian worldview. I hadn't expected to hear it from Andrew, but I think I just have. It is, and that turns out to be relatively important in terms of this present set of difficulties that we're talking about. In terms of the issue of hypocrisy, I was always acutely aware when I met with foreign counterparts on behalf of the State Department, urging something like the status quo arrangements in terms of internet governance, that in the immediate background, what the foreign counterpart saw was this. So I know what you're saying. I know what you're really saying. The United States invented the internet. The United States controls the internet. The United States companies profit disproportionately from the internet. And United States security services have privileged access to everything that travels over the internet. Now, one could say, recognizing that this is what our foreign counterparts thought, that our efforts in terms of trying to promote the status quo in terms of internet governance and in terms of recommending that censorship be avoided, one could say, well, there's obviously something hypocritical going on here. But I think, in fact, one can accept, to some extent, the realities of what our foreign counterparts were concerned about, particularly after Snowden. It's relatively easy to accept some of it. But nevertheless, recognize that there is a very large difference between censorship and spying. And the conflation of these two things is something that people interested in human rights ought very hard to try to avoid. I mean, we don't want there to be, to come to an understanding that there's an equivalence between the two things. And I think this is really the point that Andrew was making a moment ago. On some level, We know that spying and espionage is going to take place. We also know when the concerns, the security concerns have evolved from state actors to non-state actors, from something that's relatively well-defined to something that turns out to be much broader, that the net is going to be expanded a good deal in terms of trying to identify individuals who might wish us or our allies or others harm. But this still doesn't mean that we are recommending censorship, that we are recommending that freedom of expression be compromised. So the distinction, it seems to me, on one level isn't hard to understand. It may be hard to be entirely persuasive with others who, for whatever set of reasons, would prefer to see the two things combined. But it turns out they're different, and it's important that we continue to press the point that they're different. As to the kind of ever-present possibility that the most powerful nation in the world is hypocritical in terms of some of its international outreach, I mean, that's, as Andrew suggests, I mean, that is an ever-present aspect of our international relations.
So Rebecca, it's not hypocritical to say the United States should control the internet because will do the best job of safeguarding freedom of expression. It is hypocritical to say that, but actually use that control to advance U.S. commercial and security interests. I mean, how do you view this?
I'd like to take a step back a little bit. And what this is fundamentally about, I mean, Ambassador Rivera mentioned Hobbes. This is about power. And this is about, you know, internet freedom is not about, you know, let's have a state of nature, right? It's about how do we have, you know, rights protected situation where when people abuse, when anybody abuses their power, be it a company, be it a government, be it some other group, over a person's right to access information, over a person's communications, over a person's digital information. When power is abused, that it be held accountable and constrained in some way. I mean, that's what this is really about globally. And a disintegration of trust in whether power can be constrained and held accountable, and whether abuse of power can even be identified, let alone prevented, by any number of entities, including the U.S. government, including other governments, including companies, and so on. So I want to come back to what Andrew said about U.S. companies and how it's in their interest, increasingly global internet companies, to become stateless. Because what this points to is an increasing disconnect in the commercial interest. The success of Google is that the rights of all Google users, no matter where they live, whether they're a US person or a non-US person, their rights have to be protected equally if Google is going to be a successful global company, right? But because Google is headquartered in the United States, and despite the fact that your former colleagues at the NSA may have been fairly scrupulous about protecting the civil liberties of the U.S. persons, they had no mandate to give a fig about non-U.S. persons' rights to privacy or rights to anything else, right? And so we have a contradiction here in terms of how the nation state views its security obligations and who it believes it is accountable to, which is its citizens and the people who elected the leaders of that nation state, if we're talking about democratic states, versus the commercial interests and obligations and human rights obligations and responsibilities, frankly, of global internet companies. That unless they can reassure their users and customers that, whether you're in Egypt or whether you're an American citizen, I, as Google, care about your rights equally and committed to you equally, everything, the business model falls apart, and frankly, the globally interconnected internet falls apart, and we get this kind of balkanization that Andrew was alluding to, where increasingly governments say, well, you, my citizen of India, let's say the Indian government says, okay, Indian citizens, I have no way of ensuring that the rights of my citizens are not abused if they're using Google, unless Google puts its servers in India and subjects itself to my law. And then sort of everything increasingly becomes balkanized in terms of every government exercising sovereignty over the data of people that relate to their. But then the problem then becomes this, that, you know, I've been doing a lot of research about kind of what's going on with different surveillance laws in different countries, and also what different companies around the world are doing or not doing when it comes to privacy, free expression, and so on. And the problem is that India, you know, it doesn't have good privacy laws. In fact, it's building something like PRISM. And so we have this problem where governments, in their effort to kind of defend the rights of their citizens, ostensibly, are asserting sovereignty over the digital communications and activities over their citizens without being held accountable sufficiently, because they don't have particularly good laws constraining their own surveillance. And local companies also, you know, the local competitors to the international companies tend to have much less robust protections, both on privacy and on how they deal with government demands and so on. So what this comes back to, and I know I'm kind of painting a broad picture here, but what this comes back to is that unless you have a commitment from the world's major democracies, including the United States, which we have failed to do so far, that, you know, under our obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right, we've made a commitment to human rights, not just U.S. persons' rights, right? But we interpret it really as our obligations only kind of really U.S. persons, actually. But if we continue that interpretation of our international human rights obligations as a government, basically that's going to result in a balkanization of the internet. And unless there is greater commitment to universal protections of universal rights of everybody who's using the internet, and the governments are making that commitment and agreeing to be constrained and held accountable in a meaningful way, in addition to companies recognizing that they have international human rights obligations, which many, you know, a number of these companies are doing. You know, they're signing on to the Global Network Initiative Principles on Free Expression and Privacy and saying, yes, you know, we are trying to actually implement universal human rights standards, and trying to demonstrate, despite the obstacles, that they actually are committed to a universal standard of human rights. Unless you get that commitment both by companies, but also by the world's major democratic nations, the picture is not looking good.
So let me come back to Ambassador Verveer and to Andrew here. I think we would all agree that a balkanized internet is a bad thing, and that the risk of that has increased to some extent since Snowden.
Unless you live in the Balkans, in which case it might be great.
Right.
Right. We were trained in the White House to see fragmentation.
They're especially for, okay, yes, good point, thank you. But you know, the question is, what is the alternative, or what is the justification for the current alternative, Ambassador Verveer, which is basically a U.S.-controlled internet? I mean, how can we make that case? You know, however bad you think what the NSA was doing was or not, how do we make the case in international forums for the level of U.S. dominance of internet policy that we have now?
Well, I think first it warrants saying that the critical circumstance is this: the United States actually does not control the internet. That the Commerce Department contract with ICANN is a formal proposition, but it's something that has virtually no practical consequence. One could, but I think our domestic politics will preclude this, one could find a new set of modalities where the formal control, if you will, with respect to ICANN was reposed elsewhere, not in the Commerce Department contract that, again, is essentially meaningless, but in some sort of appropriate group of, let's say, international wise men and women. Set that aside, though, for a moment. So, but the first point is, we don't control the internet. There is a problem persuading others that we don't control the internet. I must say, I don't think I was particularly persuasive with respect to dealing with foreign counterparts and trying to make that point. But we need to continue to try to make that point. There's a very important proposition I want to come back to that relates, Rebecca, to some of the things that you were suggesting. It's certainly true that the International Covenant is a very important document. It's a very important recognition of the inherent rights of all human beings. Our internet freedom propositions, in fact, conform with that. They depend upon that as a kind of legal matter. And it turns out that whatever one may think of what NSA has done, the International Covenant doesn't say you as an individual are free from surveillance. What it says is you have certain rights, and you may well have a right to privacy. You may well have you certainly do have a right to not having your political expressions and so forth interfered with. But this comes back to a fundamental difference that is terribly important, which is there's a very large difference between censorship on the one hand and spying on the other. And one of the interesting complexities that we have in the United States, that we have generally, is we are proceeding, when we talk about these things, from our First Amendment sensibilities. Most of our counterparts around the world do not share these First Amendment sensibilities. In fact, most of our counterparts, including a great many democratic nations with which we have very large cultural similarities, think we're nuts in terms of the kinds of things that we're permitted, we're willing to tolerate. Pornography, for example. Things that incite sectarian differences and violence, for example. So that we are in a situation where it seems to me we don't have to acknowledge, we don't have to admit, and indeed I don't think we are unprincipled in terms of the kinds of things we're asserting, but we have to be very careful not to let the Snowden issues or the admitted very serious problems that our major commercial operators have in terms of trying to operate around the world on a single model somehow obscure our commitment to these First Amendment values and to the avoidance of censorship in accordance with the International Covenant.
Andrew, do you agree with Ambassador Verveer that the U.S. doesn't really control the internet, and how do we, be that as it may, how do we justify internationally the preeminent position we have with regard to internet controls? And while you answer that, I should say we're going to open up to questions in a minute, so if anyone has a question, I think just stand up and I'll call on you.
Yeah, so I'd love to deliver a wonderful fight here, but no, actually I agree wholeheartedly. The United States government in no way controls the internet. So the internet is voluntarily interconnected networks that speak a common language for turning communications into packets. I mean, that's what the internet is, right? There is no central controller, there is no central hub. What the United States has benefited from massively is being first. And because we were first to adopt the internet and deploy it widely across our networks, and because we're a rich country where new computers are bought every couple of years and new mobile phones when they came out, we became the early center of gravity for the internet. And that's benefited us economically, it's benefited our intelligence agencies. What's happening now is a dramatic acceleration of something that's been underway for a long time, which is the move from a unipolar internet market where all of the big companies and all the big and important players from connectivity to application layer services were based in the United States to one in which it's at least as Chinese an internet now as it is an American internet. It's at least a third world internet now as it is a first world internet. It's definitely more of a mobile internet now than it is a desktop internet. And that's just because, here's a great, I was just thinking about this morning. How many of you in here have heard of Line? 1, 2. So Line has, it's a mobile communication service, 300 million users, growing fast. It'll probably be double that by the end of the year. It was built by a Korean company's Japanese unit, started in Japan, it's huge in Indonesia. It's colossally big, and none of you have heard of it. And that's the sign of the world that we live in right now. So the United States doesn't control it, never has, couldn't. What we do is we look out for the independence and sort of effective operation of an entity with zero command and control authority that is respected to make decisions for the naming and addressing functions of the internet that allow these voluntarily interconnected networks to stay interconnected. So, yes, we don't control it. And the second part of the question.
Well, the question is, how do we just? I mean, I think in a way you've sort of answered it. But given that it is the domain name registry is based on this contract with the Commerce Department, how do we make the case that is the appropriate mechanism for deciding who can have what domain?
So, so the bargain that the United States has been trying to cut is to say, on the one hand, the internet has scaled flawlessly, right? It has gone from 4 computers, University of Utah, UCLA, USC, Stanford, in 1969, to now there are 6 billion devices around the world. I mean, that over the course of a couple of decades, it's amazing. Yeah. And so the central argument is, look, we've had this kind of like voluntary system staffed by experts, run by nerds, essentially depoliticized. Just let it keep going. Like, all we can do here is screw this up. So that's been one part of the argument. The other part is, you don't really need to be stressed out about it because A, you can go and participate just like everybody else in the operation of this thing, and B, within your own domain, within your own borders, you are sovereign. You're in control. You can decide what you want. When I was at ICANN, this was always a very tenuous bargain to try to advance because, for example, we would have these disputes like, what do you call whoever operates the .tw domain? What do you call that? Do you let them sit at the table with the Chinese government? And we did, and the Chinese said, we're boycotting. There's just certain kinds of politics that are embedded in semantic strings that you just can't get rid of. But anyway, there are elegant ways and well-understood ways to try to handle that.
Who has a question here? Yes, starting in the back of the room.
Hi, this is Lina. I'm information system engineer from Syria. I want to ask a question about the U.S. sanctions on Syria. We know all now that in Syria we have 34 blue coat servers censoring the internet connection in Syria, and the government is using them to persecute the human rights activists in Syria. How can these sanctions be more reviewed or have a more fair application for these sanctions on Syrian situation to support the civil rights movement in Syria and protect people? The second question is about this.
Maybe we'll try to get a few in. Could I just have maybe Rebecca answer that one, and then because I want to try to get a few more questions in.
Okay.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, there's actually a sanctions-related event going on at New America Foundation right now. Blue Coat is an American company that I won't get into too many details for those of you who haven't heard of Blue Coat, but that sells a product that, among other things, will enable a government to track people's activities on the internet in a fairly finely grained way. And my understanding is that those servers, once their existence in Syria was uncovered by activists, Blue Coat claimed that they hadn't sold the technology to Syria. They'd sold it to somewhere else, and then various sellers had sold it to Syria. I understand there's a Commerce Department investigation underway. I haven't checked recently the status on that, but clearly there are companies that are getting around sanctions, and this is one of the bigger, broader problems with surveillance technology is that a lot of these technologies are initially developed in the United States, in Western Europe, at the request, either for other security purposes, just to protect networks, or in some cases, for instance, in the case of another technology called NARAS, by a company called NARAS, that creates, that provides the technology that's been used at AT&T by the NSA in their secret room at AT&T, but that technology then gets sold all over the world. Once it's developed kind of within the context of a democracy that claims, oh, we're only going to be using it for limited and constrained purposes, and then that technology ends up proliferating into all kinds of places and is used by governments to attack citizens.
So can I just make
And this is a huge problem.
So just to relate this back to something more, this is like the nub of the issue. So we want our libraries, public libraries in this country, to monitor what their patrons are doing. Some parts of Congress anyway do. Corporations want to be able to monitor what's happening on their corporate networks in order to protect themselves against threats and keep people from using racist or sexist language. You know, we've got all these other reasons why this technology can be deployed in a perfectly sensible way. The problem is, if it exists within a framework of rule of law, then we can set rules and we can have some assurance that those rules will be followed. When that technology is moved across a network which is globally interconnected and everybody uses the same standards into a country where rule of law either doesn't exist or is abused, that's a problem. And the fundamental geopolitical issue, which the companies always have to struggle against, is that countries with different values about free speech and shaky protections through an incomplete or corrupted rule of law are most of our allies. And so, the world that we live in is one in which, like in the Indian context, clearly a democracy, unquestionably a democracy, but has a legal system which is highly susceptible to abuse on the basis of sectarian interests, regional interests, political rivalries, and so forth. You take the technology that we've built here for one purpose and you put it into that context, and it becomes abusive.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental, that's the nub of the problem.
I think I saw a question over here. Yeah. Yes, that's you. Yeah.
I'll just go with no, Mike.
Please.
Eileen Donahoe, I was the U.S. Ambassador to the Human Rights Council, and yesterday a lot of people were talking about the trust issue and how devastating the surveillance revelations have been to the U.S. ability to lead. So I completely agree with that perception of loss of trust. I want to come back to, I think, joining some comments by Rebecca and Ambassador Revere on the subject of ICCPR. My understanding is that the U.S. has interpreted those obligations to only apply to our obligations with respect to our own citizens. We don't apply those standards extraterritorially. And I think that goes to the subject of whether we have any responsibilities to citizens around the world. And I'd love you to speak on that. And then I want to challenge this idea. I understand the distinction between censorship of freedom of expression on the one hand and surveillance and those things being different. But there is a way in which they elide. And, Frank LaRue has talked about the essential privacy being a very core aspect of freedom of expression. And if there is no space in which you can form your thoughts, share your thoughts with whom you want to, in effect, you've lost your free speech. And that's why I'd love you to comment on that.
You've sort of covered a lot there. I'm going to ask everybody to kind of wrap up. I'm afraid that's the last question, but to just kind of briefly wrap up your comments with an answer to both of those questions. So you go first, but go fast. Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't have much time.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the problem with the ICCPR. If we're interpreting it only for our own citizens and not globally, I think we have a real problem in a globally, digitally interconnected age. Having legitimacy, constraining power, just having enough trust in the network for it to function and for people's rights to be protected and respected. And speaking to this other point, absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, there's censorship, there's espionage, and then there's surveillance. There's kind of three. And surveillance, as Frank LaRue, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, showed in his report that came out shortly before the Snowden leaks, he is finding that surveillance, when it is not done in a sufficiently narrow and accountable way, does chill speech. And actually, the PEN American Center, which represents the rights of writers in this country, recently did a study where they interviewed writers around this country about the extent to which surveillance affects them. And they found very clearly that concern about surveillance in this country is affecting people's decisions about what searches they're making on the internet, the kind of research they do, the kind of communications they have with sources online. It's chilling people's choices of the subject matter they're pursuing, the conversations they're having digitally. Writers in this country, not Syria. So there is a link between freedom of expression and surveillance that's serious and real, and that we need to pay clear attention to.
Ambassador, do you have a final comment here?
Yes, first, Ambassador, I agree with you that there clearly is some overlap or some linkage between the surveillance activities and concerns about censorship. But it is very far from a complete overlap, and from the standpoint of the United States and others who are concerned about internet freedom, we need to be careful not to overstate that. One related point that comes out of the Snowden revelations, those revelations have made it much more apparent that the technologies and techniques associated with data mining, with predictive analytics and the rest, are going to create an environment where the things that Rebecca was just describing are absolutely real. And it turns out to be the sort of thing that our policymakers are going to have to work very hard at in terms of trying to understand how much space should be made available for individual inquiry and arrest without any reason for anxiety that somebody is watching. In light of technologies and techniques that are going to make it extraordinarily easy for anybody who wants to know everything there is to know about his or her neighbor whenever they feel like knowing it.
Andrew, I'm going to give you a very brief last word.
So let me try to end on an optimistic note.
Yes, thank you.
So here's two things to keep in mind. One is our political system is, despite all of its flaws, capable of resilience and capable of evolution. And I don't mean system in the really grand sense, but I think our policy framework around surveillance must and it can change in order to protect our own self-interests. And I think that starts with showing some concern and earning back trust, not just from American citizens, but from people outside the country. It's in our economic interest to do so. It is in our interest as an advocate for human rights and freedom around the world. Second and last point, it is always worth restating why the connection between spying, espionage, surveillance, and free speech is so tight. And it is this, that especially in this country where the idea of self-reinvention kind of like lies at the heart of our national character, the value of the mutant idea, the genetic mutation that comes out of the shadows and becomes the next generation of species, the next generation of idea, is so valuable. And if any country should understand the importance of being able to think mutant thoughts, read mutant books, have mutant conversations, and develop ideas that seem crazy, unpopular, and so forth, it's this country. And for that reason, for people to genuinely have freedom of inquiry, freedom to develop thoughts, and freedom to think unpopular things, it's this country. So I very much hope that we will embrace that part of our national character in this new age and take seriously the significance of privacy to give everybody the space in order to breathe intellectually and to develop themselves and then to express those views under our First Amendment.
Well, I want to thank you all for a great conversation. Thank you for joining us.